Frank Sinatra was halfway through the second verse of "I've Got You Under My Skin" when he saw the man stand up in the front row, not to applaud, not to leave. The man stood up slowly, deliberately, and stared directly at the stage with eyes that held no admiration, only cold intent. The Copa room at the Sands Hotel fell into an uncomfortable silence as 2,000 people sensed something was wrong. The band kept playing, but the notes seemed to fade into the background. Sinatra's voice faltered for just a moment, something that almost never happened. Then the man in the expensive dark suit raised his hand and pointed directly at Sinatra's chest. The year was 1962, and Las Vegas was a city where men in tailored suits could make other men disappear without consequence. The casinos, the hotels, the entertainment industry, everything flowed through channels controlled by organized crime. Frank Sinatra understood this better than most. He had built his career navigating the complicated relationships between show business and the underworld. He performed at mob-owned venues, counted mobsters among his acquaintances, and maintained the careful balance that survival in this world required. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, someone wanted to send a message that the usual rules no longer applied. The man pointing at Sinatra was Anthony Castellano, an enforcer for the Chicago outfit who had earned a reputation for violence that made other criminals uncomfortable. Castellano was not a man who attended concerts for entertainment. He was a man who attended events to conduct business, and his business often involved intimidation, extortion, and occasionally murder. His presence in the front row of Frank Sinatra's show meant only one thing. Someone powerful had decided that Sinatra needed to be reminded of his place in the hierarchy. The question was why, and whether Sinatra would survive the answer. The audience held its collective breath as Sinatra stopped singing entirely. The band trailed off into silence, leaving only the ambient hum of the room's air conditioning. 2,000 people sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to draw attention to themselves in what was clearly a confrontation between forces far beyond their understanding. Waiters stopped serving drinks. Security personnel shifted nervously but made no move to intervene. Everyone in that room understood that what was happening on the stage had nothing to do with them and everything to do with powers that operated in shadows. This was Las Vegas in 1962. You did not interfere. Sinatra stood at center stage, microphone in hand, looking down at Anthony Castellano with an expression that was difficult to read. Those who knew him well might have recognized the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes that preceded his famous temper. But outwardly, he appeared calm, almost amused. He had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing unruffled, of projecting confidence even when circumstances warranted fear. It was this quality, more than his voice, more than his charm, that had carried him from Hoboken saloons to Hollywood stardom. Fear was something Frank Sinatra refused to show. The confrontation had been building for weeks, though Sinatra had tried to ignore the warning signs. It started with a message delivered through an intermediary, a polite request for a meeting that carried undertones of obligation. Sinatra had declined, citing a busy schedule. A second request followed, less polite, more insistent. Again, Sinatra declined. He was not accustomed to being summoned like an employee. He was Frank Sinatra, the most famous entertainer in America, and he met with people on his own terms, or not at all. This attitude had served him well throughout his career. Tonight, it had brought Anthony Castellano to his front row. The Sands Hotel had been Sinatra's home base for years, a place where he held partial ownership and commanded respect from everyone on the staff. He had helped make the Sands legendary, bringing his Rat Pack friends to perform shows that drew visitors from around the world. The Copa Room was his domain, his stage, where he reigned supreme. The idea that someone would come into his territory and challenge him publicly was almost inconceivable. But that was exactly what was happening. Anthony Castellano stood in the front row of Frank Sinatra's own showroom, making a statement that everyone present understood. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Sinatra's mind raced through possibilities. He knew men like Castellano. He had dealt with them throughout his career, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resisting, always calculating. The key to surviving in their world was understanding what they wanted and deciding how much you were willing to give. But this public confrontation suggested that normal negotiation was not what Castellano had in mind. This was about humiliation. This was about demonstrating to everyone in Las Vegas that no one, not even Frank Sinatra, was beyond the reach of organized crime. The smart thing to do would have been to acknowledge Castellano, perhaps invite him backstage for a private conversation, diffuse the situation before it escalated further. That was what the rational part of Sinatra's brain suggested. But Frank Sinatra had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing when his pride was at stake. He had punched journalists, confronted critics, and challenged anyone who dared to question his authority. The idea of backing down in front of 2,000 people, of showing weakness to a thug who had invaded his stage, was simply unacceptable. What happened next would become legend in Las Vegas, a story told in whispered conversations for decades to come. It would cement Sinatra's reputation as a man who feared nothing and no one, while simultaneously raising questions about whether he was extraordinarily brave or remarkably foolish. Some would say he risked his life that night. Others would argue he knew exactly what he was doing. The truth, as always with Frank Sinatra, was probably somewhere in between. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great generosity and terrible rage, of calculated strategy and impulsive action. That night, all of those qualities would be on display. To understand why Anthony Castellano stood in that front row pointing at Frank Sinatra, you need to understand the complicated web of relationships that connected entertainment and organized crime in 1962 America. Sinatra had navigated this world since his early days in Hoboken, New Jersey, where his family had connections to men whose business interests extended beyond legitimate enterprise. His uncle had involvement with the Genovese crime family, and young Frank learned early that success in the nightclub business required accommodation with certain powerful interests. These were lessons he carried throughout his career. The specific dispute that had brought Castellano to the sands involved a matter of respect, or more precisely, a perceived lack of it. 3 weeks earlier, Sinatra had been asked to perform at a private event in Chicago, a birthday celebration for a significant figure in the outfit's hierarchy. The request had come through proper channels, with appropriate compensation offered and assurances of discretion provided. For most entertainers, such a request would have been honored without question. Refusal was not something that men in the organization were accustomed to receiving, but Sinatra had declined, citing prior commitments that his representatives claimed could not be rescheduled. The truth was more complicated. Sinatra did have other commitments, but he also had grown tired of being treated as an employee who could be summoned at will. He had performed countless private events for organized crime figures over the years, always aware that refusal carried risks, but equally aware that his fame provided certain protections. He believed, perhaps incorrectly, that his status as America's most famous entertainer made him untouchable. The Chicago organization had decided to demonstrate that this belief was mistaken. They sent Anthony Castellano to deliver the message. Frank Albert Sinatra had been born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only child of Italian immigrants who had worked their way up from poverty. His father, Anthony Martin Sinatra, was a lightweight boxer and tavern owner. His mother, Natalie della Garaventa, known as Dolly, was a formidable woman who worked as a midwife and operated as a political force in their community. Young Frank grew up surrounded by ambitious people who understood that success often required bending rules and making uncomfortable alliances. By 1962, Sinatra had achieved a level of fame that few entertainers had ever experienced. He had won Academy Awards, sold millions of records, and become synonymous with a certain kind of sophisticated American masculinity. His voice, smooth and powerful, had soundtracked the lives of an entire generation. His performances at the Sands with Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop had redefined what Las Vegas entertainment could be. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful performers in the history of American show business. But success had not made Sinatra cautious. If anything, it had intensified his legendary temper and his unwillingness to accept authority from anyone. He had famously walked off film sets when he felt disrespected. He had punched gossip columnists who wrote unfavorably about him. He had ended friendships over perceived slights and rekindled them over gestures of contrition. His personality was volcanic, capable of erupting without warning over matters that others might consider trivial. This volatility made him fascinating to audiences and dangerous to work with. The night of the confrontation had begun like any other performance at the Sands. Sinatra arrived at the hotel around 6 in the evening, spending time in his suite before heading to his dressing room. His valet had laid out his tuxedo, the same classic style he always wore on stage. His pianist, Bill Miller, had gone over the evening's set list. Everything was proceeding according to routine. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The sold-out crowd filed into the Copa room, excited to see the chairman of the board perform. Anthony Castellano had arrived separately, purchasing an entire table in the front row for himself and 3 associates. The Sands staff recognized him immediately and quietly alerted hotel management. Word filtered up the chain of command, eventually reaching people who understood exactly what Castellano's presence meant. Someone made the decision not to inform Sinatra before the show. Perhaps they hoped Castellano was simply there to enjoy the entertainment. Perhaps they were afraid of how Sinatra would react. Either way, the singer walked onto that stage without knowing what awaited him. The first half of the show had proceeded without incident. Sinatra worked through his standard repertoire, the songs that audiences expected and loved. His voice was in excellent form, his banter between numbers characteristically witty. The crowd responded enthusiastically, and Castellano sat silently in the front row, watching without reaction. It was during the second song after intermission, "I've Got You Under My Skin," that the mobster made his move. He stood up slowly, deliberately, ensuring that everyone in the room would notice. Castellano's gesture, pointing directly at Sinatra's chest, carried unmistakable meaning in the vocabulary of organized crime. It was a threat, a promise of violence, a demonstration of power intended to humiliate. The message was clear. You are not beyond our reach. Anywhere you go, any stage you stand on, we can touch you. The men who controlled the shadows behind Las Vegas had decided that Frank Sinatra needed to be reminded of the hierarchy. His refusal of the Chicago request had been interpreted as disrespect, and disrespect could not go unanswered. The room seemed to contract around that pointed finger. Staff members who had been circulating among the tables froze in place. Guests, who had been enjoying their drinks, set their glasses down carefully. The band members exchanged nervous glances, but kept their instruments ready, uncertain whether to continue playing or retreat. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something significant, something that would have consequences extending far beyond this evening. Las Vegas was a small town in many ways, and word of what happened here would spread quickly. Sinatra's reputation for handling pressure was well established. He had faced hostile audiences, demanding directors, and personal crises that would have broken lesser men. He had emerged from career downturns that seemed insurmountable, winning the Academy Award for From Here to Eternity after years in the wilderness. He had rebuilt himself multiple times, always projecting confidence and control. But this was different. This was a direct physical threat from a man known for carrying out such threats with brutal efficiency. The singer's mind processed the situation rapidly. He understood what Castellano wanted: submission, acknowledgement, fear. The enforcer had come to demonstrate that Sinatra's fame meant nothing compared to the power he represented. Any normal person would have complied. Any sensible entertainer would have apologized, agreed to the original request, done whatever was necessary to make the threat go away. But Frank Sinatra had never been normal or sensible when it came to challenges to his authority. What Castellano did not understand, what perhaps he could not understand, was that Frank Sinatra had spent his entire life refusing to submit to men who thought they could intimidate him. He had grown up in the brutal streets of Hoboken, where showing weakness invited attack. He had survived the collapse of his career in the early 1950s by refusing to accept defeat. He had built an empire on the foundation of never backing down, never apologizing, never showing fear. To submit now, in front of 2,000 witnesses in his own showroom, would destroy everything he had created. The silence in the Copa room stretched toward infinity. 2,000 people waited to see what would happen next. Anthony Castellano kept his finger pointed at Sinatra's chest, his face expressionless, confident in the power he wielded. He had done this before with other men who had trembled and begged and ultimately complied with whatever was demanded of them. He expected Sinatra to do the same. He was about to learn that expectations and reality did not always align when dealing with the chairman of the board. Frank Sinatra lowered the microphone slowly and looked directly at Anthony Castellano. The room remained absolutely silent. Then, in a move that defied every instinct of self-preservation, Sinatra began walking toward the edge of the stage. Not away from the threat, but toward it. His steps were measured and deliberate, each one bringing him closer to the man who had just publicly threatened his life. The audience watched in stunned disbelief. This was not how confrontations with the mob were supposed to end. This was not how anyone was supposed to respond to Anthony Castellano. Sinatra reached the edge of the stage and stood there, looking down at Castellano from perhaps 3 feet away. The mobster's finger was still pointed, but now it was pointing at Sinatra's legs rather than his chest. The dynamic had shifted subtly. Castellano was looking up at the singer, who occupied the higher ground both literally and symbolically. It was a small advantage, but in moments of confrontation, small advantages could matter. Sinatra seemed to understand this instinctively. He made no move to step down from the stage, maintaining his position of elevation. When Sinatra finally spoke, his voice carried the same smooth confidence that had made him famous. It was the voice that had seduced audiences for decades, that had crooned love songs, and swung with big bands, and whispered intimate secrets into millions of ears. But now that voice carried a different quality, something harder and more dangerous. He asked Castellano if he was enjoying the show. The question hung in the air, its casual tone completely at odds with the tension in the room. It was as if Sinatra was inquiring about the weather. Castellano's expression flickered with something that might have been confusion. He had expected fear, capitulation, perhaps an attempt to escape. He had not expected this calm inquiry about his entertainment satisfaction. The enforcer lowered his pointing finger, though his hand remained visible, ready to make another gesture if needed. He told Sinatra that they needed to have a conversation. His voice was rough, accustomed to issuing commands rather than making requests. But there was something uncertain in his tone now, something that suggested the encounter was not proceeding as planned. Sinatra smiled, that famous smile that could convey charm or menace depending on the context. He told Castellano that he was in the middle of a show, that 2,000 people had paid good money to hear him sing, and that whatever conversation needed to happen could wait until he had fulfilled his obligations to his audience. The words were polite on the surface but carried unmistakable defiance beneath. Sinatra was not going to interrupt his performance for anyone, certainly not for a man who had tried to intimidate him in his own showroom. The response created an impossible situation for Castellano. He had come to humiliate Sinatra publicly, to demonstrate the power of the organization he represented. But Sinatra had turned the confrontation into something else entirely. By refusing to show fear, by treating the encounter as an inconvenient interruption rather than a life-threatening crisis, he had stripped Castellano of his leverage. The enforcer could escalate, could pull a weapon, and create a scene that would bring law enforcement attention to everyone involved. Or he could back down and look weak in front of witnesses who would talk. The 3 men who had accompanied Castellano shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had expected this to be straightforward. Show up, make the threat, watch Sinatra crumble. Instead, they were watching their boss stand with his arm at his side while the target of their intimidation smiled down at him from the stage. This was not how things were supposed to work. They exchanged glances, silently communicating their uncertainty about how to proceed. The script had been thrown away, and no one had written a replacement. Sinatra turned to look at his audience, breaking eye contact with Castellano deliberately. He apologized for the interruption, explaining that sometimes people got confused about how to get backstage passes. The line was a masterful piece of verbal judo, simultaneously dismissing Castellano as a confused fan while undermining the gravity of the confrontation. Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous laughter that released some of the tension that had been building. People were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. He turned back to Castellano and suggested that if the gentleman really wanted to talk, he could wait in the lounge until the show was finished. His tone was hospitable but firm, the tone of a host addressing a guest who had overstepped boundaries. The message was clear. You are in my house, playing by my rules. Whatever authority you represent outside these walls does not apply here. Sinatra had reclaimed control of the situation through sheer force of personality, transforming a public humiliation into something that resembled a minor social awkwardness. Castellano stood motionless for a long moment, processing what had happened. In his experience, men who refused to back down ended up in very bad situations. He had personally arranged for several such situations over the years, but this was different. The eyes of 2,000 people were on him, including journalists, casino executives, and various people whose testimony could cause problems. Creating a scene here would bring exactly the kind of attention that the organization worked hard to avoid. The enforcer made his decision. He nodded once, curtly, and sat back down in his seat. His associates followed his lead, lowering themselves into their chairs with visible relief. The confrontation was over, at least for now. But everyone in that room understood that this was merely a postponement, not a resolution. The underlying dispute remained unaddressed, and Anthony Castellano was not a man who forgot slights. Sinatra had won this round, but the fight was far from finished. Sinatra turned back to the band and nodded. The musicians, who had been watching the exchange with barely concealed terror, picked up their instruments and began playing the introduction to My Way. It was not the song that was supposed to come next in the set list, but it was the perfect choice for the moment. The lyrics, about facing challenges without regret, about doing things on one's own terms regardless of consequences, could not have been more appropriate. The audience seemed to understand, applauding before Sinatra even began to sing. He performed the rest of the show with the intensity of a man who had just stared down death and emerged triumphant. His voice soared through the familiar songs, investing each lyric with new meaning. The audience responded with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. They had come to see a legend perform, and they had witnessed something far more memorable. They had watched Frank Sinatra refuse to be intimidated by one of the most dangerous men in Las Vegas. The story would be told and retold for years. Anthony Castellano and his associates remained in their seats through the entire performance. They did not applaud. They did not order drinks. They sat silently, watching Sinatra work through his set. Their presence, a reminder that unfinished business waited. When the show ended and the house lights came up, they rose and walked out without a word. The crowd parted around them instinctively, no one wanting to be too close to whatever violence might eventually follow. Sinatra went to his dressing room after the show, pouring himself a bourbon and lighting a cigarette with hands that he willed not to shake. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind the cold awareness of what he had done. He had publicly defied an enforcer for the Chicago outfit. He had humiliated a man whose profession was hurting people who humiliated him. The consequences of this choice would need to be dealt with. And soon, his manager, Hank Sanacola, arrived within minutes, his face pale with anxiety. He had watched the confrontation from the wings, convinced that he was about to see his client murdered on stage. He demanded to know what Sinatra had been thinking, whether he understood the danger he had placed himself in. Sinatra listened to the recitation of all the terrible things that could happen, nodding occasionally but showing no regret. He told Sanacola that he had handled it the only way he could. The phone in the dressing room rang. Sinatra looked at it for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was calm and measured. the voice of someone accustomed to speaking carefully. It identified itself as representing certain interests in Chicago, interests that were concerned about the evening's events. The voice suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that perhaps a conversation could clarify matters before the situation became more complicated. Sinatra agreed to a meeting, naming a time and place of his choosing. The voice accepted without negotiation. The meeting took place 3 days later in a private room at a restaurant in downtown Las Vegas. Sinatra arrived alone, despite the objections of his manager and friends who worried about his safety. He understood that showing up with bodyguards or associates would signal fear, would undo everything he had accomplished on stage. If he was going to navigate this situation successfully, he needed to project the same confidence he had displayed in the Copa room. He walked into the restaurant as if he owned it, which, in a sense, he did. His fame gave him a kind of ownership over every room he entered. The man waiting for him was not Anthony Castellano, but someone higher in the organization's hierarchy, a representative empowered to make decisions rather than merely deliver threats. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, drinking wine and eating pasta like old friends catching up. The conversation ranged across many topics, before finally arriving at the matter that had precipitated the confrontation. Sinatra explained his position clearly. He was happy to cooperate with reasonable requests, but he would not be summoned like an employee. He was Frank Sinatra. He deserved respect. The representative listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When Sinatra finished, the man acknowledged that perhaps the initial request had been phrased poorly, that the organization had approached the situation without appropriate consideration for Sinatra's status. He proposed a compromise. Sinatra would perform at the postponed birthday celebration, but as a guest of honor rather than hired entertainment. The distinction was subtle but significant. It allowed both parties to maintain their dignity while resolving the underlying dispute. Sinatra agreed, shaking the man's hand to seal the arrangement. The incident at the Sands became legendary in Las Vegas, a story that entertainers and casino workers told to illustrate the unique position Frank Sinatra occupied in the city's ecosystem. He was both insider and outsider, connected to the shadowy powers that controlled the industry, yet somehow immune to their usual methods of influence. His courage that night, his refusal to back down, earned him respect that transcended his musical achievements. Even men who operated outside the law appreciated someone who stood their ground against overwhelming odds. Anthony Castellano disappeared from Las Vegas shortly after the confrontation, reassigned to duties far from anywhere Sinatra might encounter him. The Chicago organization had decided that the enforcer's approach had been counterproductive, that his public humiliation had reflected poorly on everyone involved. Whether Castellano received additional punishment for his failure was never confirmed, though rumors suggested his career in the organization suffered significantly. Men who failed in their assignments rarely received second chances. Sinatra performed at the birthday celebration in Chicago as agreed, delivering a 2-hour show that reportedly moved the guest of honor to tears. The relationship between the singer and the organization settled into something resembling mutual respect. They needed him for his talent and his star power. He needed them for the opportunities and protections they could provide. It was a transactional arrangement, the kind that characterized much of Las Vegas in that era. Both parties understood the terms and honored them. The story of that night in 1962 was told and retold over the following decades, often growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions claimed that Sinatra had pulled a gun of his own. Others said that he had walked off stage and physically confronted Castellano. None of these embellishments were true, but they spoke to how powerfully the incident had captured people's imaginations. The reality was impressive enough. Frank Sinatra had faced down a mob enforcer with nothing but his voice and his attitude, and he had won. Frank Sinatra continued performing at the Sands and other Las Vegas venues for years afterward, never again facing a public confrontation of that magnitude. He remained a complicated figure, a man of enormous talent and equally enormous ego, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. But those who witnessed the events of that night, or who heard the story from reliable sources, understood something essential about him. He was not merely an entertainer. He was a man who refused to bow to anyone, regardless of the consequences. That quality, more than his voice, more than his fame, was what made Frank Sinatra a legend. In a city built on gambling, he had bet everything on himself and won.